On behalf of World Mizrachi and Kosher Travelers, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this mini-series of virtual Jewish heritage tours to Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, India and Italy. But first, a brief look at my personal journey. I'm a first-generation South African. My late mother was born in Lithuania, my late father was born in Latvia, and my late grandmother, who I refer to as Boba Bela, regaled me with stories of her youth in Lithuania, still in the times when it was behind the Iron Curtain. And that fired my imagination about my personal history and where we came from. But this all came to life in 1996, when the Jewish Agency invited me and a group of other people to participate in the Future Leaders Forum, where we were taken to various countries in Eastern Europe to see the work of the Jewish Agency in repatriating Jews to the Holy Land, to the State of Israel. So what were black and white photographs in my childhood all of a sudden had depth, perspective and colour. In 1996 I went to Poland, in 1997 I went with the Jewish Agency to Lithuania, and thereafter, for 15 years, I travelled with World Mizrachi from Argentina in the west to China and Japan in the east, to India, to Western Europe, to Eastern Europe, and explored the rich Jewish culture and history which is contained in those countries. Approximately 5 years ago, David Wallace, who together with his wife Hannah run Kosher Travelers, phoned the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, Rabbi Dr. Warren Goldstein, and asked him that since he had just written a book with Rabbi Beryl Wine about the Jews of Lithuania, if he would be able to join them as their scholar in residence on tours of Lithuania. The Chief Rabbi politely declined and said that he had too much on his plate to deal with, but they should speak to Hugh Raichlin, who is a practicing attorney but has spent many years researching Lithuania and many other countries and has travelled there and seen the places themselves. They called me, and since then we have had an incredible relationship where I've been their scholar in residence for trips to Lithuania, Belarus, Morocco, India and many other countries across Europe. I firmly believe that in order to fully understand ourselves, we have to understand where we come from. I believe that every Jew taps into a stream of consciousness that goes back from the time of Abraham until today, where we are part of everything that our people have experienced. I see the hand of God Almighty, that through this window of history, we can see how we've been guided, how we have survived against all odds. And not only that we've survived, but we have thrived and we have made an inordinate contribution to the world. So I therefore invite you, on behalf of World Mizrachi and Kosher Travelers, to have a taste on this virtual travel, but that one day I hope that you will meet me in person and that I will meet you. And together we will get on the bus, get on the train, get on the plane, and go and visit these magnificent communities all over the world and see and appreciate the magic and the majesty of Jewish history. Hi, my name is Hugh Raichlin and I'm from South Africa. I'm actually a first-generation South African. My late mother was born in Lithuania in a place called Vorna or Varniai, and my father was from Latvia, from a place called Kraslava. So I grew up with parents that spoke to me about the countries from which they came, and later on in life I had the privilege of having my grandmother live with us in our home. And when I got home from school, she used to regale me with the most wonderful stories of her childhood in the shtetl of Vorna. And that was really what ignited my passion and my interest for understanding my roots. She told us about the little house in which she lived in the village, how her mother had a haberdashery next door, about the sand streets of the shtetl, and this beautiful way of life that they had, and the beautiful colors that they were surrounded with, trees and rivers and grass. But I couldn't reconcile that with all the black and white photographs that she showed us in the album. I then had the privilege in 1997 of going to Lithuania and Latvia for the first time, and in fact we went to Belarus as well, and got a feel for what it must have been like in Eastern Europe. And I started grappling with the incredible history of the Jews of South Africa, because over 90% of the Jews of South Africa came from Lithuania and from Latvia. They used to talk about it as being Russia, but we know that it was mainly Lithuania. And I today am going to take you on a virtual travel through Latvia and Lithuania and bring to life the beautiful sights, sounds and places that were enjoyed by our forebears, and thank God they were able to escape before the Second World War, before the Holocaust, which wiped out 90% of those Jews that were left behind in Lithuania and Latvia. So for those of us that think that Eastern Europe is still what it was in the former Soviet Union, a little dorp, little village, I thought that this might be a good way to start. This, believe it or not, is a photograph of Vilna as it looks today, a thriving metropolis. And really, it's a great tribute to the Lithuanian people, how they've managed, since extricating themselves from the rule of the Soviet Union, to build up a modern city in Vilna, in Kaunas, Kovna as we know it, and to really rejuvenate the economy. Let us have a look now at where Lithuania and Latvia are in the world. This is a map of the Baltic Sea, and Lithuania and Latvia are two states of the three Baltic states, which are made up of Estonia, with its capital in Tallinn, Latvia, with its capital in Riga, and Lithuania, with its capital in Vilna. These are some beautiful visuals of the wonderful city that Latvia is today. And you can see that it's modern. Here's a beautiful lake. And these are places that you would expect to see anywhere in Central Europe. And here we see a beautiful street scene in modern Riga as it is today. Lovely tree-lined streets and some of the beautiful architecture and this wonderful building that we have in front of us. And it didn't take us long to come to the synagogue in Riga, which is a fully functioning synagogue with a rabbi and a community. And this is a view of the top of the synagogue, just to give you an idea of the architecture and the feel and look of the exterior. And this is the interior of the synagogue. And you'll see written above the ark of the synagogue the verse from Tehillim, from Psalms, Baruch Hashem shelo netananu teref leshinehem. And this is a great message that the Latvian collaborators, that the Nazis and all the anti-Semites were not able to destroy the Jews despite their best endeavors. And this is for me so beautiful, that when we go back to these places, that we go back and we recall the martyrs that were there, but the fact that we have survived, that there's still a thriving synagogue, and that we as Jews, as proud Jews, keeping our traditions, keeping our religion all over the world, are the survivors of those that were in these places before we got there. And here is the rabbi of the synagogue, and we generally on all our tours all over the world, we go to synagogues at the time when the community are praying so that we can join with them. Because one of the motifs that I constantly talk about in all the trips that we do is that the greatest definition of Judaism is that we're a family. And here we're joining with our family members, with our brothers, coming together in prayer in the synagogue. And it's also important that the synagogue should be a place which is used, that's not just a museum. That is the tenor behind doing all these heritage tours that we do all over the world. And it was beautiful to see at the back of the synagogue a young man with his young children learning. And this is what Judaism was all about. It was transmission from father to son, passing on our learning, passing on our traditions. And here you see once again what we saw in that verse in the synagogue, that despite what the anti-Semites have done in the world to eradicate Jewish culture, the Jewish people continue to learn not only globally, but in these places of destruction as well. There was this wonderful sign outside, which I thought is quite rare, where it says that synagogue, it advises visitors that the synagogue is open from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m., but the synagogue is closed on Saturday and Jewish religious holidays, which is very, very unusual because, as we were saying earlier, these are places where people come to learn, and thank God there's a thriving Jewish community. But it must be understood that this is in downtown Riga, where the Jews no longer live. So on the Sabbath and other Jewish holidays, they have other places of worship outside the city. As we walked around Riga, we saw where the former synagogue, one of the most famous synagogues, was in Riga. Today it is a museum. The synagogue itself was burnt. There were a number of Lithuanian refugees that had come over the border from Lithuania into Latvia, and they came to this particular synagogue, the Gogol synagogue in Riga, and it was razed to the ground. It was burnt to the ground with the congregants inside the synagogue. And that was a terrible, terrible atrocity that was perpetrated by the Nazis, where they would put Jews into the synagogue and destroy the synagogue together with the Jews inside. But we are grateful to the Latvian government that they have recognized this as being a place where they can memorialize the Jews of Riga. And this is a view from across the street. Once there was a magnificent, a proud, beautiful synagogue standing there, and today you just have some of the stones at the bottom which create the memorial. And this is a photograph of the actual synagogue that was there in the up until the early 1940s, when it was destroyed in 1941 by the Nazis. It's also very interesting that there were different schools of thought. The Jewish community was, as we see it today, there was diverse thought about approaches to Judaism and trying to deal with how does one live a living Judaism in this world. There were those that had stuck to orthodoxy as it had always been, but then there was the Haskalah movement. There was a movement that said, in order to avoid anti-Semitism, let us try and assimilate, keep our Jewishness, but try and assimilate more with our neighbors, and maybe by being less different, that will be a way of surviving. Unfortunately, as we know, the truth is that when the Nazis came in, they didn't distinguish between Orthodox Jews or more assimilated Jews, and they were all put to death. But we walked past a building which was a Haskalah school in Riga, and we know that Moses Mendelssohn was the father of the Haskalah. He originated this idea of assimilating with the Gentiles, and during the early 1840s, the government entrusted a man by the name of Max Lilienthal to be the principal of this particular Jewish school in Riga, and to establish a system of government Jewish schools of which the language of instruction was German initially and later Russian. Lilienthal was a German, and German was, of course, was the language of the people that led European culture, so to speak. And later on, it was Russian that was introduced, and the children, the Jewish children over here, were exposed to the Russian language. They had a knowledge of the Russian language, of arithmetic, and they changed their dress. They came out of the typical Jewish dress that was worn in Eastern Europe and started looking like their Gentile neighbors. And the Maskelim, those people that embraced the Haskalah, were drawn closer to the Russian language and culture. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that it did unfortunately lose many Jews from Judaism as their children intermarried. We then walked to the old part of Riga, and here you can see some buildings that were owned by Jews in the older part of Riga. And you can even still see the building of the Jewish hospital in what later became the ghetto of Riga, but it was a very popular part of Riga where the Jews lived. And it's still to this day called Bikur Cholim, which means in Hebrew, visiting the sick. And you can see that Jews in Eastern Europe, as they are during the rest in the rest of the world, are entrepreneurial. They build their own infrastructure, they build their own charity organizations, they build their own schools, they build their own hospitals, as you see in America and Canada and many other places in the world. And it was no different, because this is where the Jewish people came from. That wonderful ability to be in a society, but yet to create a sense of independence. Because Jews are the people that want to give to the world, they want to create, they want to make the world a better place, and they don't just want to ride on the shoulders and the infrastructure of others. And here again, just taking you through the city, giving you an idea of another Jewish building that was in the Jewish quarter. And this is a typical Jewish home in Riga, where a Jewish family may have lived, and you'll see the typical slant of the roof, which of course was important because during the snow you would want the snow to come off the roof, and the double glazing on the windows, the wooden frames, and the double glazing of course was there because of the cold, and they were also thick walls that had wool, lamb's wool and various other things inside the walls to insulate the walls to keep the people warm. And to this day, there's still a street called Jew Street, Ibriu Ila, Jew Street. So you see that within the culture, and you see it in Vilna, and you see it in many other places, that the Gentiles have had at least the sensitivity to keep the names that the Jews had given them, to remember this wonderful contributive people that had been in their society. Just outside Riga, there is a massive forest called the Rumbula forest, and this was a short bus ride out of the city. And after the Jews had been collected from various parts of Riga and put into the ghetto, they were then transported in trucks, in open trucks, from Riga to the places of mass execution outside Riga. And this is the Rumbula forest, where there were mass graves that had been dug, and Jews were taken here on a daily basis and shot and buried, their bodies pushed into the graves, and the graves are still there today. And as you can see over here from this particular sign, along this road in November and December 1941, Nazis and their local collaborators drove to death in the Rumbula forest thousands of Jews from the Riga ghetto. The erection of this monument is funded by the former ghetto prisoner Boris Kliot, whose father Moses, mother Rosa, sisters Pessa, Mira, Bertha and Sarah were also killed in Rumbula. And I think it's important, and that's the reason that I read this particular sign, that we should understand that these were people, there were names, there were faces, these were brothers, sisters, mothers, grandmothers. Because when one talks about 6 million Jews, you can't even get a grasp on the enormity of the tragedy. And that's what we bring out on these wonderful heritage tours that I'm privileged to do with the Kosher Traveler and with World Mizrachi, where we put names to faces and we try and identify with the enormity of the tragedy. These are some beautiful visuals that I took of the flat fields. Lithuania is very flat, there are no mountains, very fertile, beautiful, verdant fields and forests all around you. And this is just to give you a feel of how beautiful it was. And as I mentioned earlier, when I saw the black and white photographs of my grandparents, I couldn't believe how beautiful Lithuania was and how green it was and how agricultural it was. And the truth of the matter is that most of the Jews, particularly in Lithuania, lived in small towns. There were 2 major cities in Latvia, I beg your pardon, in Vilna there were about 60,000 Jews, in Kovno about 30,000 Jews, and then the balance, making up a community of about 240,000 Jews, was spread through small, what we call shtetl, villages throughout the country, where you would have sometimes 100, 200, 300 Jews living in a town. And very often they comprised a large number, sometimes up to 30% of the people living in the town or the village. And as we continued to drive through, this is still Latvia, but it's very close to Lithuania, and the geography is very similar. You can see these beautiful fields and agriculture thriving. There were people in our group that went back to Vabalinkas. That's where their family came from. And here we come to Ponevezh, and once again I think it was quite a surprise for many people to see what a beautiful city Ponevezh really is. And the yeshiva building still stands there. That was built by, as I said, Rav Yosef Kahneman. He actually came to South Africa a number of times to raise funds. And the Ponevezh yeshiva that stands today in Israel, in fact, was built with South African money that he had raised over here from the Litvak community. Litvak is the name given to those people that came, the Jews that came from Lithuania. And the Litvakas gave very generously in South Africa. From 1919 to 1940 was the Ponevezh yeshiva. And this is what it looks like today. Today it's a bakery. But thank God, we still have the building, and you can see that this was a very impressive building that was built by Rav Kahneman. And this is behind the bakery, the other buildings in which the young men that would learn in the yeshiva would live in. And you can imagine, 1919 to 1940, this was a very impressive building and a beautiful building that must have cost a fair amount of money. And then, of course, Rav Kahneman, as well as being a Talmid Chacham, a very learned man, was responsible for the finances, not only to build it and to maintain it. And as you can see, as I said earlier, this is now a bakery today. And some views around the yeshiva building. There's no question that there was not a glass building at the time that the Ponevezh yeshiva actually was functioning, but as you can see, it's become a modern place with a modern infrastructure, and all the old buildings are being taken away. And that's another reason why I think that these heritage tours are so important, particularly to Eastern Europe, so that we should try and see it as authentically as it was then, before it gets replaced by modernity. We then moved on to Kaunas or Kovna, and this was the site of mass destruction of the second biggest Jewish community. The biggest was in Vilna, the second biggest was in Kaunas, in Kovna, where the Jews were actually marched out of Kovna, out of the city. They were taken out of the Kovna ghetto. Some of them were taken on vehicles, and they were taken just out of the city to what were Russian forts that were built around the time of the First World War. Solid big forts that were there to protect the Russians, but actually were useless at the time that they were needed. But instead the Nazis, with their evil genius, took possession of these particular natural features that were there and turned them into places of mass execution where tens of thousands of Jews were shot and buried. And this is a memorial to the Jews that perished in the 9th fort in Kovna. This memorial was put up by the Russians, and there are many interpretations as to what it means. One of the ideas is that there are hands coming out of the earth, because there were so many bodies in the earth and they were reaching heavenwards. And this is just to remember the victims that perished in this place. And here you can see a visual of the 9th fort with very thick fortifications. It was built under a hill, so it was very difficult for Jews to escape from these places. These places were built with tremendous amounts of brick and concrete and mortar by the Russians to keep people in. Once you were in, you couldn't get out. So what could hapless Jews that had been traveling for hundreds of miles, sometimes from all over the world, on transports, as well as those that came from Kovna, what hope did they have of escaping once they were taken in here, followed by barking dogs and by armed guards? And you can see the exterior of the 9th fort over here, with a guardhouse at the end, and a Nazi would sit in the guardhouse armed and would shoot anybody that attempted to leave. And of course the barbed wire on top of the walls. And this is a walk through Kovna as it is today, just to give you a feel of this beautiful walkway through the city. And as we walked down the street, Leisva Street in Kovna, lo and behold, we found the home of 3 of the participants in our trip. And this is a photograph of Minion Millwood with her husband Edgar, and there was also Dr. Sue Bleeden with us and June Edery. And that photograph that Minion is holding is that is not a photograph, it's actually a postcard that was sent to her father from this address, 57 Leisver Street in Kovna, where her late father lived. And this for them was quite unbelievable, that there was this old postcard that had been kept by the family for decades, and they were able to take a photograph outside 57 Leisvers that still stands today. As you can see today, it's been changed into a shopping district, but that's definitely the home. And they were told by their father that above this particular building there was a library. By the way, this over here you can see is the date stamp when it was posted from Lithuania, and there is the library on top. All those windows on top with that light brown, that was the library. So the library still functions as a library today, but I can assure you that there wasn't that wonderful beer store next door. But this is how the modern has still managed to retain some of the old, and they were able to find their father's home. There's the biblioteca, proving that it is still a library to this day. The Lithuanians, they say, are the tallest nation on earth, and that's why I think that basketball is very popular in Lithuania. And there you have Sue Bleeden on the right-hand side, you've got Minion Millwood in the middle, and my wife Michelle on the left-hand side, surrounded by 3 young Lithuanians that happened to be walking down Leisvers. And when I saw the height of these people, I said, hold on a second, we need to take a photograph of these little Lithuanian Jews, all of them. My wife's family were from Lithuania, and you heard about the others as well. And they are here walking amongst the tall Gentiles that the Lithuanians are to this day. Quite remarkable, very cute. Then we went to the Kovna synagogue, the Chorshul that still exists and still functions today in Kovna, and Jerusalem Street. Here we are, the street named after the holiest city in the world today for the Jews, Jerusalem. The Choral Synagogue, that's what we were referring to. The interior of the synagogue, very beautiful, very well kept. The pulpit, and in front the ark. And you can see over here Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, who was one of the great rabbis of the early 20th century, and he was in Kovna. And then over here we also have Rabbi Shapiro, who was also a rabbi in Kovna pre-Second World War, Harav HaKohen Avraham Dov Shapiro. And we'll see his house a little bit later. And these are the pupils of the yeshiva in Kovna. A photograph of the back of the synagogue, just to give you an idea of the size and the beauty of the synagogue, and thank God it was saved, it survived the war, and as I said, a functioning synagogue to this day. And now we take a walk across the city to the Kovna ghetto, and a memorial to the Kovna ghetto where the Jews were rounded up. There were walls that enclosed this area that the Jews couldn't get out. I have a very great friend who's today is 93 years old, Blian Hara, Soli Ganor, that lives in Israel, and he was in the Kovna ghetto and wrote a book, Light One Candle, and he talks about life in the ghetto and how they used to trade in books and used to read and educate themselves. There were people that used to do performances. So these were people that were steeped in culture and the arts, and tried under horrific conditions to continue that life in the ghetto. And this is a photograph of our group being explained by the local guide about the Kovna ghetto. And here we're walking through, and these are houses that were once occupied by Jews. As I said, we transported in a capsule back in time to what it must have looked like then. I saw this tall gentleman walking on his own, and I walked up to him and I said to him, do you know any people that remember the Jews here? And he said, actually, I do. My mother-in-law remembers the Jews, and she was very close to some Jewish girls. Let me call her. So we said, no, we'll come in and see her. He said, no, I'll bring her out into the street and she can talk to you. And she's holding her heart over here because she was so absolutely dumbstruck that these were Jewish people that were coming back to her town that she could speak to, and she burst into tears. You can see her here. She burst into tears talking about her beautiful Jewish friends, the friends that she had over there, and how when the Nazis came in, she saw them being killed. She saw others that were shot over the bridge and falling into the river of the city. And she spoke with such fondness about the wonderful friends that she had and the wonderful Jewish people that surrounded them in those years. And as we continue to walk around Kovna, you see a typical house that was occupied by Jews before the Second World War, still in lovely condition, that typical wooden structure, the Lithuanian architecture that we've been talking about previously. And that house today stands where the synagogue was. So that was where Rabbi Shapiro's synagogue was, on that corner. That's the photograph, and that's what the site looks like to this day. And that was Rabbi Shapiro's house, a very beautiful house. And just to show you that the house is still standing, but unfortunately the people themselves are no longer there. But we can still keep them alive in the way that we live, the values that we have, that we should perpetuate those beautiful values that they stood for and taught, and that we should teach others. And you can see here that it was on the corner of Panirel and Karnavas streets. That was where Rabbi Shapiro lived. And this is a photograph of the Slobodka Yeshiva. This is a beautiful image of the Slobodka Yeshiva. What we understood was that the previous Slobodka Yeshiva was going to move into this new building, but before they could take occupation, the Nazis came in and wiped out the community and murdered the boys that should have been learning in this particular building. A magnificent story comes out of Kovna as well, and that is the story of the late Chiwene Sugihara and his blessed wife Yukiko, both of them of blessed memory. He was the consul, the honorary consul in Latvia, in Lithuania rather, in Kovna in 1940, and he was actually there as the Japanese consul. And as we know, the Japanese and the Nazis, the Germans and the Italians were all fascists. That was that fascist axis that existed. Yet, of course, as we know in politics, you spy on your friends. And the Japanese wanted Sugihara to spy on what was going on with the Germans, the movement of the Germans and the Russians. Sugihara himself was fluent in Russian. He had been sent earlier in his career to Russia. And this very building was the consulate. And about 6,000 Jews were saved by Chiwene and Yukiko Sugihara. And today there are over 40,000 Jews in the world because of the moral strength of what Sugihara did. These are the people lining outside the embassy in about 1940. The consul rather. The inside where Sugihara sat with the Japanese flag. This is a recreation of the desk that he had and where he typed out those wonderful life-saving visas. Then we went to a fascinating shtetl called Zezmarai. And this particular shtetl has become famous because they are restoring one of the only wooden synagogues in the whole of Lithuania. So to begin with, as I've pointed out to you earlier, there's normally a square in the middle of the town, and this is no different. This is the town square, and you can see it from a slightly different angle. You can see the church in the background because the Lithuanians were generally religious Catholics, and there's the steeple of the church. So the shuls were always had to be sure that they were lower than the highest church in the village. And that is a view of the church on the far side. And a beautiful lane through the shtetl of Zezmarai, that typical architecture that we've been talking about, with that quite a steep roof, with the wooden windows, the double glazing. And you can see the sand road that my Bobby used to refer to as the blotter, the mud that it became in the rain. And you can see a typical street scene, and that to me is once again what's so beautiful, that you can go in 2020 and see what it was like in 1920 and 1820 and possibly even 1720. We then arrived at the beautiful city of Vilnius, and here you can see some of the lovely architecture, some of the narrow streets that you find in the CBD, the central part of Lithuania. They've blocked it mainly. The only reason that you'd get a vehicle there would be maybe to deliver something to some of the businesses or the hotels. But our bus couldn't navigate the street. It's been turned into a pedestrian mall. And here we all are pushing our suitcases towards this old hotel that we stayed in. It was an old building from a few centuries ago that they've renovated and turned into a beautiful hotel. Of course, you can't talk about Vilna without talking about the Gaon of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. Gaon meaning genius, and Vilna the city that he came from. So his name was Rabbi Eliyahu ben Shlomo Zalman Kramer, born in 1720, died in 1797 in Vilna, and he was a child prodigy. So from the day he was born, they realized that the Gaon of Vilna was different. And at the age of 7 years old, he gave a drasha, he gave a lecture, a Torah lecture in the main synagogue of Vilna. I was told that there were times in Vilna where 300 people knew the whole of the Babylonian Talmud, which is tens of volumes. They knew it off by heart. So if you can imagine the extent and the greatness of the learning, and yet they asked the Gaon of Vilna to give a sermon, to speak in the shul at the age of 7. You can begin to imagine who he was. And this is a sketch of what the great synagogue of Vilna looked like before it was destroyed by the Germans. And this is the great synagogue of Vilna. Today there is still, thank God, a functioning synagogue in Vilna known as the Chor Shul, the only remaining shul in Vilna, which still functions as a shul. There is also the Chabad house where they have a synagogue, but this is the main shul. And it was just so beautiful. One day I went to pray at the morning service, Shachrit, in the small synagogue of this main synagogue. And I landed up sitting next to an old blind man. And we got chatting, and he said, "For wo kommst du? Where do you come from?" I said, "I come from Durham, Africa. I come from South Africa." And he says to me, "Willst du sehen die Kever von die Gro? Do you want to see the grave of the Gaon of Vilna?" And I said, "Of course, I'd love to do that." But of course I was suspicious, because many of us Westerners have been conned so many times, and it's hard to trust anyone. And the lesson I learned from that was that my late grandfather, Zayda Yankelebe, who was born in Vorne in Lithuania and went to live in Cape Town and had those ethics, he said, Hirsch, that my Yiddish name, he said, "Hirsch, you know, in Lithuania people used to shake hands on a deal. They were honest." He said, "It's only in the modern world and in other parts of the world that you see people today that are so dishonest." So I had no reason to suspect the old man, but I was a little bit concerned that maybe he wanted money from me. He didn't really want to give me a key. Anyway, lo and behold, after the service in the morning, he put his arm through my arm, and arm in arm we walked down the stairs into the street, and there happened to be a key shop underneath in the street that cut and sold keys. And it's still there to this day. I've been back several years later, and it's still working there. There's a locksmith there. And the old man gave him a key, and he cut it to size, and he gave it to me, and I offered to pay him, and he wouldn't take any money for it. And I said, "Right, I'm off to the cemetery." And I went with my 2 friends, and we went to the cemetery, and we went to the mausoleum of the Gaon of Vilna, and there's an old steel door, and I put in the key, and I turned it, and I opened it, and there it was. And I got a beautiful visual to show you of the inside of the grave, the mausoleum of the Gaon of Vilna, which we'll see shortly. One of the other graves that we saw in the Vilna, in the cemetery in Vilna, was the grave of Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski, who was a preeminent rabbi in Vilna, the chief rabbi of Vilna, and he was the Av Beis Din, he was the head of the court, and he was the halachic authority of his time, a great Talmudic scholar in Vilnius, and he lived in Lithuania in the late 19th century into the 20th century. And during his remarkable 55 years of community service, he was recognized as the leading posek, the person that decided halakha, the application of Jewish law to different scenarios from people all over the city and all over the world. And he was the spiritual guide of his generation, just like the Gaon of Vilna was in his day. He fielded halakhic queries from all parts of the world, and he consulted on many different Jewish communal issues. And here you can see a photograph of the late Rav Chaim Ozer Grudzinski Zatzal and his mausoleum that is in the cemetery in Vilna. What's interesting is that Rav Chaim Ozer became the chief rabbi at the age of 22, the young age of 22. They say that he was a genius as well, and he could do several things at once. He could speak and he could write, from what I've been told, 2 different answers using the right hand and the left hand. He could be writing out 2 answers to 2 questions and speak. A remarkable human being. And this is the photograph I took of the inside of the mausoleum of the Gaon of Vilna that I mentioned earlier. And the Gaon of Vilna's grave is actually in the middle, and his wife and children are to the side. And one of those graves over there is that of Avraham ben Avraham, Zeichet Tzadik Livrocha, Graf Potocki, who came from a noble Polish family that got attracted to Judaism, and he heard the sound of learning. He found his way into a yeshiva with, as I understand, a friend of his. They started learning, and in fact they had to flee into exile. They went to the Netherlands to avoid being caught by the Poles, because this was a terrible thing that he had done. It was treacherous, what he had done by converting to Judaism. But he learned for many, many years, and eventually he decided to come back to Eastern Europe and was unfortunately found out. And they say that his mother was instrumental in getting him arrested, and he was burnt for the terrible crime of becoming a Jew. He was burnt at the stake on the grounds of the Vilna University. Quite ironic that a place of learning should be used for such a barbaric act. And the Jews collected his ashes, and to pay tribute to this great human being, buried him in the same mausoleum as the Gaon of Vilna. And that is the gate that I opened with the key to the Gaon of Vilna's kever. Then in Vilna you will see the Rom, the building which housed the Rom printing press. Now, those people that are familiar with Talmud will know that most of the Gemaras, the Talmud that we use all over the world today, is the same print that was printed by the Rom printing press in Vilna, and you're looking at the building today. It's no longer a printing press, it's used by a foreign company, but it was started, this particular business was started by Baruch Rom in 1789. The Rom Hebrew printing press was the first printing press in Lithuania, and its crowning achievement was the publication of a new edition of the Talmud, which is still the standard print that we have in the world today. So Gutenberg, as we know, started the printing press many hundreds of years ago, and from the research it appears that he was Jewish. But we know about the Sonsino press in Italy, and we see over here that the Rom printing press was another example of how printing was able to make accessible to Jews all over the world the wonderful texts of the Talmud and many of our other Jewish publications. One of the people that we were really honored and privileged to meet in Lithuania was Professor David Katz. And this is a photograph of Professor David Katz, who was born in the United States of America and now lives in Vilna. And we had the privilege to go to his beautiful home, whose walls are filled with books. And he's a very, very special man. For 18 years, he was the professor of Yiddish at Oxford and also the visiting professor at Yale University. If you want to read about him and learn about his views, because he is virtually standing up in a one-man battle against the Lithuanian government that want to rewrite Jewish history and make it look like the Lithuanians were victims and the Jews were part of the perpetrators, have a look at www.defendinghistory.com. And he's a man that needs support materially and emotionally, and he's a wonderful, wonderful person to assist in that battle. And essentially the Lithuanians even got to the point where in May 2008 the Lithuanian prosecutors launched an investigation of 2 elderly Holocaust survivors, Fania Jochelis Brandkowski and Dr. Rachel Margolis, and David Katz embarked on an activist phase of his life to bring to the attention of the world how the Lithuanians wanted to accuse these women partisans who fought against the Germans in the Second World War. The Lithuanians claimed that they were fighting against the Lithuanians, and that Jews were perpetrators as much as they were victims. And David Katz has gone around the world raising tremendous awareness and getting tremendous support from people to not allow this nonsense myth to take hold. So I encourage anybody that goes there to try and make contact with him. This is the Ponar forest just outside Vilna, and if you recall, we spoke about the Jews of Riga being either marched or transported out of Riga to the Rumbala forest and murdered there. So the Jews of Vilna were either marched or they were driven out in trucks to the Ponar forest, where they were murdered in massive pits that had actually been built or dug by the Russians around the First World War, that was supposed to be for storage of fuel, that the Nazis, with that evil genius, turned into a place which could be mass graves for the Jews of Vilna. And this is a memorial in the Ponar forest, surrounded by members of our group, where we said memorial prayers, and people were given an opportunity to speak about their feelings about being in this place and to pay tribute to those who lost their lives in the Ponar forest. And this is one of the plaques, eternal memory of 70,000 Jews. Can you imagine 70,000 Jews? Like a whole stadium that one would use today for a sports stadium. All of them murdered and buried in this Ponar forest. 70,000 Jews of Vilnius and its environs who were murdered and burnt here in Panarai, that's the Lithuanian for Ponar, by Nazi executioners and their accomplices. And it's in Russian as well. And here you can see it was obviously a very deep pit once, but it's been filled with human bodies. They would also throw logs and lime onto the bodies to cause decomposition quicker, and then to burn and incinerate the bodies, and all that ash lies in these open pits in the Ponar forest. Another view of one of those pits. And when we were there, they were filming a movie which today is on Netflix. I think the title is something to do with tunnel in the Holocaust. And they were actually filming there, and they used technology, latest technology, to trace a tunnel that had been dug by Jews through one of these pits out into the forest, and was an escape way for people that had been taken into Ponar. So once again, it wasn't just people being passive. Wherever there was a gap and wherever there was a way out, they certainly tried. That brings us to the end of our overview of Lithuania, and we cross the border now into Belarus, which was once White Russia. And for those that can read Russian, that sign over there says Radin, and this is to give you a feel of the little town, this little hamlet, where one of the giants of Jewry lived, by the name of the Chofetz Chaim, Harav Meir Kagan. And this is a street leading into the town. I do not think that it was tarred in those days. There was no asphalt, but it was, I'm sure, a sandy road, but obviously time has passed. But yet the buildings remain and the yeshiva remains. So this is the yeshiva of the Chofetz Chaim in Radin that you are looking at right now. A very big and impressive, a beautiful building that must have looked a lot more beautiful 70 or 80 years ago. And a side view, still in good condition. And I spoke, and I gave a lecture on the book of the Chofetz Chaim, which is about the laws of Lashon Hara. And I reminded our group about the different laws about not speaking badly about other people, not diminishing the stature of people in other people's eyes, what to say and what not to say. And we did this as a tribute to the late Chafetz Chaim, that it should be an elevation to his soul, that still to this very day we are improving the lives of human beings by taking to heart his instruction not to speak derogatorily about other people. We mentioned earlier about the Volozhin Yeshiva, and this is the yeshiva in Volozhin, started by Reb Chaim Volozhin, who was one of the outstanding pupils of the Gaon of Vilna. And it was called the Eitz Chaim, the tree of life. And that is what Jewish learning is all about. Our Torah is the tree of life. And you can see over there that it was established in 1803 by the prodigious Rabbi Chaim Volozhiner, and was known as the mother of yeshivot. Why? Because it became a model for all religious schools because of its world-renowned educational methodology, great prodigious teachers, and high level of scholastic students who became religious leaders, great rabbis, poets, and writers. That was the fertile intellectual atmosphere that was generated in what was a relatively small building. But the quality of people that were created and how they branched out all over the world and really developed the world as we see it today in the 21st century. We davened mincha, we said our afternoon prayers outside, because once again we don't want this to be just a building. We want to identify with its past, and it's a message that religious Judaism is still alive and well and thriving, and we were back there to offer our prayers to God. After we left Volozhin, we headed towards Minsk, and if you have a look at this road sign that says Minsk at the top, obviously in Belarus, that's the spelling of Minsk. And we arrived in Minsk to see a very grayish, I would say typical Soviet Union kind of architecture. That's what modern Minsk looks like today, certainly skyscrapers that you didn't see in the mid-20th century. And we were greeted by this beautiful Chabad house, the synagogue in Minsk. It looks to me to be very similar to a Torah scroll with the two Eitz Chaims on the outside and the klaf, the parchment in the middle. But I didn't speak to the architect, and I'm not sure about that. But we were greeted so warmly by Rabbi Schneur Deitch, the chief rabbi of Minsk, and this is a lovely photograph of him, and the wonderful warmth and love that radiates in every place we go to was so tangible. We then went into this wonderful Chabad house in Minsk, and here you can see Rabbi Deutsch dancing with Jerry Greenberg of Canada, and all of us clapping and cheering. You can see me there in the background with my checked shirt. And it's just too beautiful the way you don't even have to speak the same language, but when you meet another Jew somewhere else in the world, it's family. And I've always said the best definition of Judaism is not race or religion, it's family. We all come from Abraham, and we're a tiny, tiny people in the world, and we have these wonderful, strong cultural roots with a wonderful way of life that all of us keep wherever we are. And it's beautiful. That's been my experience over all the years. It's well over 20 years that I've been traveling the world, and you just connect with Jews in a very special way, as you can see happening over here. After Minsk, we went to another town called Slonim, and I'm sure that there are many people in the world that, as I say Slonim, will say yes, that's where their forebears came from, and I'm sure people have said that throughout the talk. And this is the lovely town of Slonim. They've got some flowers over here in the town square in the middle, and you can see some of the buildings around Slonim and some of the older buildings. These are the buildings that our grandparents might have lived in, and I know that my grandmother told me, for example, that on Tu B'Av, the festival where we celebrate the fruits, the first fruits, they could easily collect 15 different kinds of fruits from all the fruit trees that grew around their house. And here you can see a beautiful, typical house, Lithuanian house. And when I say Lithuanian, I know that we're in Belarus, but Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, those Baltic states were all part of Greater Lithuania at one stage. So the cultural links are very, very strong. The Chofetz Chaim would be known as a Lithuanian rabbi, even though technically he was in Radin, which is today Belarus, but Greater Lithuania encompassed many of these places. And you can see the lovely garden. Here's a fruit tree growing outside. And once again, to pick up on what we said earlier, all the black and white photographs that we were all brought up with, here you see, on the contrary, beautiful, green, fertile, lovely flowers growing around the home. We then saw the ancient synagogue of Slonim, which was once a magnificent building, and you'll see the inside architecture as well, but as you can see, fallen into disrepair with that blue metal fence, corrugated iron fence around the Slonim Shul. But we were led via a back path and we went inside. There were a lot of homeless people in the synagogue living there and treating it with disdain. It was very, very painful to see. And I'm absolutely delighted that I read on the internet that there is a group of people that have now started raising money to refurbish this wonderful synagogue in Slonim and to bring it back to its former glory. It was built in 1642 and only fell into disrepair at the time of the Second World War. I would guess around 1941, 1942. Our group got together, we did a flash mob. One of the girls in the group was carrying an Israeli flag, and we took it out and we were singing Am Yisrael Chai, may the Jewish people live, once again celebrating the fact that we were Jews that had survived. All of us are from families that had survived the Holocaust, that had come back. And this is part of the group, and it was amazing when we started to sing. People peered out of their windows, people that were walking down the street turned around, what's going on? The Jews are back, the Jews are singing. And there was no negative repercussions, there was nothing that happened other than the fact that people were just absolutely amazed to see this bunch of crazy Jews singing with the Israeli flag outside a destroyed shul, which one day, please God, will be rebuilt so beautifully. This is the inside of the synagogue, and you can see some of those old ancient murals still on these beautiful arches on the inside of the synagogue. Some of the different angles that I took of the interior, very high, triple volume, beautiful arches, beautiful wall murals. Have a look at this. This was the Aron Kodesh, the Ark, also with the beautiful original paintings above it. And here we are, we were talking about the Chofetz Chaim a few minutes ago. Yevarechecha, the blessing of the Kohanim. That's the very first word, and we just recently read it in the Torah that we read on a weekly basis. Yevarechecha Hashem v'yishmarecha, Ya'eir Hashem panav elecha v'choneka, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lacha shalom. Through the Kohanim, God blesses us. And the Chofetz Chaim, as we know, was a source of blessing for the whole Jewish people. And our Kohanim, to this very day, after 2,000 years since the temple was destroyed, when we were blessed by the Kohanim, in every synagogue across the world, the Mikdash Me'at, our mini temples, you still have the Kohanim blessing us to this very day. For me, it's something quite astounding. And so grateful that I have a son-in-law that is a Kohen, that just to feel that there is that connectedness to the past, that those that served in our temple, their descendants are still serving the Jewish people and giving them blessings to this day. This is the Mirror Yeshiva. So we saw the Ponevezh Yeshiva, we saw the Volozhin Yeshiva, we've seen other yeshivas. This is the famous Mirror Yeshiva. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this wonderful East European Odyssey. We've covered Latvia, we covered Lithuania, we covered Belarus, and we sing L'chaim because the Jew, as in Fiddle on the Roof, lives a precarious life, balances on the top of the roof, but plays the violin. The Jew is full of music, the Jew is full of hope, and that's why the national anthem of Israel is Hatikva, hope. We drink a L'chaim. No matter how dark it is, the Jew strives to bring light, life, and energy to the world. And that's why Jews, at a celebration, and we celebrate life, we always say, L'chaim.
When Eddie was a child, he dreamed of places far beyond his own backyard, inspiring him to become a pioneer in kosher tourism worldwide. Today, Kosher Travelers has expanded remarkably, yet continues to embrace his legacy, offering their clients exceptional quality and personalized service in unique destinations around the globe. So, start dreaming and create your most memorable vacations. Journey along roads steeped in history and Jewish heritage. Immerse yourself in cultural experiences, explore nature's great wonders, or simply relax and take time out for yourself. Kosher Travelers allows you to discover the world without compromise, offering an array of destinations and travel styles to suit, from exotic tours to Passover and Sukkot programs, summer luxury hotels, African safaris, to deluxe cruises, or alpine ski getaways. Your dream kosher adventure awaits. So stop waiting for the perfect time to travel. This is your perfect time. Plan your dream vacation today at koshertravelers.com.